When a powerful CEO mocked the black janitor on her rooftop, she never imagined he'd climb into her helicopter, and reveal a past that would shatter everything she thought she knew about power, pride, and what it means to truly fly. The morning sun had barely climbed above Seattle's skyline when the rooftop of Kensington Aerospace came alive with panic. A Bell 407 helicopter sat ready on its pad, gleaming silver in the light, rotors still. CEO Chloe Kensington paced beside it in her black tailored suit, phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp as broken glass. "No, I don't care what it takes, get me another pilot now," she snapped, heels clicking against the concrete with every turn. Below, the city buzzed awake, but up here the air was all tension and ticking seconds. Two assistants scrambled with their phones, their voices trembling, each call ending the same way, "No pilot available." The man scheduled for the morning flight had been in an accident. No backup. No plan B. The contract waiting on the other side of the city was worth $40 million, and every minute lost bled money. Chloe's jaw tightened. She hated chaos. She hated being out of control. And right now, both surrounded her. A voice broke through the noise, calm and even, cutting through the panic like a blade through fog. "I can fly it." The words came from a man standing near the maintenance door. He wore a gray janitor's uniform, sleeves rolled, mop still in hand. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark skin and the quiet posture of someone used to being ignored. For a moment, no one reacted. Then Marianne, Chloe's senior assistant, let out a short, sharp laugh. "You fly a multi-million-dollar aircraft? Maybe in your dreams." Jordan, the younger assistant, snorted nervously, as if joining in might keep him safe. Even Chloe's lips curled into a smirk. The man didn't flinch. He just stood there, his eyes steady. "What did you say?" Chloe asked, lowering her phone. "I said," he repeated softly, "I can fly it." His tone wasn't arrogant or pleading, it was factual, like he was stating the weather. The rooftop went silent for a beat. Then Chloe let out a humorless laugh and stepped closer, studying him the way she might a malfunctioning piece of machinery. His uniform was wrinkled, his hands rough, his shoes dull with cleaning wax. A janitor. Nothing more. And yet, something in his eyes made her pause. No fear. No bluff. Just calm. That alone irritated her. "You can fly it, huh?" she said, tilting her head. "What's your name?" "Liam, ma'am." "Liam," she repeated, savoring the syllables as if testing their weight. Then her expression hardened into amusement. "Tell you what, Liam. Fly this helicopter, and I'll marry you." Marianne gasped, then burst out laughing. Jordan followed, the sound echoing off the glass walls. It wasn't just laughter, it was mockery, the cruel kind reserved for people they were sure would never matter. Chloe folded her arms, expecting the janitor to back down, maybe blush, maybe mumble an apology and disappear. But Liam didn't move. He didn't laugh. He didn't even look embarrassed. He just met her eyes and said quietly, "Then watch closely." The laughter died in the air. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind picked up, tugging at Chloe's hair, scattering the stack of documents Jordan held. Papers spiraled across the rooftop like startled birds. Liam set his mop aside with the same composure he'd used to place a glass on a table. He walked toward the helicopter, each step measured, deliberate. Chloe's smirk faded as she watched him climb into the cockpit. Her rational mind screamed that it was insane, but something deeper, instinct, maybe, made her stop before calling security. The man's movements were smooth, precise, practiced. His hands touched the controls with familiarity, not curiosity. Marianne grabbed Chloe's arm. "You're not actually letting him." "Quiet," Chloe whispered, though she didn't know why. Liam glanced out the window, the morning light catching his face, calm and unreadable. The kind of calm that doesn't come from arrogance, but from experience. The kind of calm that makes you wonder what kind of storms he's already survived. You'd better hope you know what you're doing, Chloe said under her breath. Liam didn't answer. He only reached for the ignition key. The rotor blades gave a slow metallic groan, then began to turn. The hum built into a deep rhythmic thrum that filled the air, vibrating through the soles of her heels. Papers whipped against her legs, hair flying across her face, but she didn't move. She just stood there, eyes locked on the janitor in the pilot's seat. Somewhere between disbelief and something she couldn't name, Chloe felt her chest tighten. Down below, the city roared on, unaware that 40 stories above, a story was beginning, a story about control, dignity, and a man who refused to bow. Liam looked straight ahead, his voice barely audible over the spinning blades. "Let's see if you meant what you said." And with that, he lifted his hand toward the throttle, as if the sky itself were waiting for him to remember who he really was. Before he was a janitor pushing a mop through the polished halls of Kensington Aerospace, Liam Walker had worn a flight suit stitched with his name and a flag. Captain Liam Walker. U.S. Army. His hands, now calloused from scrubbing floors, had once gripped the cyclic of a Black Hawk helicopter in skies thick with sand and gunfire. He'd flown through hell and come back alive, the kind of man other soldiers trusted with their lives. On one mission over Kandahar, his bird took heavy fire. A rocket exploded near the tail, throwing the chopper into a violent spin. The radio screamed with voices, panic, orders, prayers, but Liam's voice stayed steady. "Hold on," he'd said, calm as ever. The cabin filled with smoke. He cut the engine, re-engaged, leveled out just long enough to drop his men safely on a clearing of dirt and blood. 6 lives saved that day. He got a medal. But medals don't hold you at night. Years later, when he came home, he found his house silent. No laughter, no lights. His wife, Sarah, had been driving back from a prenatal appointment when the rain started. A truck hydroplaned on the highway, hit her car head-on. She was 8 months pregnant. Liam was still overseas when it happened. By the time he got home, all that was left was a white hospital room and a premature baby fighting for air through a plastic tube. They said the baby's chances were slim. Liam sat beside that incubator for hours, his uniform still smelling of fuel and desert dust. He talked to the tiny boy like he was debriefing after a mission. "You hold on, soldier," he whispered. "You fight." The boy did. He lived. Finn. His son. The only piece of Sarah that remained. But something inside Liam never flew again. Every time he heard the chop of rotor blades, his chest clenched. He would look up at the sky and feel both longing and punishment. Flying had taken him away the night his world collapsed. He left the army within a year. No big ceremony, no farewell. Just paperwork and silence. He took whatever job didn't ask for questions, something ordinary, something invisible. Janitor fit perfectly. It paid enough for rent, enough for formula, and no one cared who he used to be. The world had moved on, and Liam preferred it that way. By day he cleaned offices and hangars filled with people who thought they were running the world. By night, he came home to a small apartment with peeling paint and one tiny bed where his son slept with a stuffed bear. Sometimes he'd wake to Finn's soft voice in the dark. "Daddy, did Mommy like helicopters?" Liam would stare at the ceiling, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space where words should be. "She loved them," he'd finally say. "She said they sounded like angels." As Finn grew, so did the questions. "Will you fly again, Daddy?" Liam always smiled, a quiet, tired kind of smile. Maybe someday. The truth was, every time he stepped near an aircraft, the memories pressed down on him like gravity. He could almost hear Sarah's voicemail from that night, her laughter through the static. "Be careful up there, okay? We need you home." He never deleted it. He couldn't. The sound of her voice was the only proof she'd ever been real. Yet the irony was cruel. The man who once ruled the sky now wiped footprints from the floor of an aerospace company. Every morning, he passed the glass case displaying miniature helicopters in the lobby. Sometimes he paused, just for a second, eyes tracing the blades. The other employees rushed past without noticing. But if anyone looked close enough, they might have seen it, the flicker of recognition, the ghost of a pilot still alive beneath the uniform. Finn noticed, though. Kids always do. He carried a small notebook everywhere, its pages filled with crooked crayon drawings of jets, choppers, and imaginary machines with wings shaped like smiles. "One day, Daddy," he said proudly, holding up one of his sketches, "I'll fly with you." Liam would ruffle his hair and nod. "One day, son." And when Finn ran off to play, Liam's eyes followed him with a kind of fear and hope tangled together. Because part of him knew that to keep that promise, he'd have to look at the sky again, and face everything he'd been running from. The rotor blades were still when Liam climbed into the cockpit, but the air already trembled with tension. The morning wind swept across the rooftop, carrying the smell of rain and jet fuel. Chloe stood outside the helicopter, her hand gripping the edge of the door. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. She was a woman who lived on control, but this felt like handing her life to a stranger. Behind her, Marianne whispered, "You can't be serious," but Chloe's voice was quiet, almost to herself. "We don't have a choice." She climbed in. The door clicked shut, sealing them in a world of glass and metal. Liam adjusted the harness with practiced ease, flicking switches with a rhythm too smooth for a janitor. The instruments came alive, gauges lighting up in a warm amber glow. He didn't look at Chloe, but his calm filled the small cabin like gravity. The helicopter vibrated, the low hum building to a steady growl. Chloe gripped the seat edge, her heart pounding in sync with the rising RPM. From outside, the assistants covered their faces as the wind picked up. The rotors spun faster, slicing through the air until the sound became a deep, thunderous pulse. The skids lifted an inch, then two. The city below seemed to fall away. Chloe's breath caught. They were airborne. For a heartbeat, it felt effortless, until the wind hit. A sudden gust from the north slammed into them, tilting the helicopter hard to the side. Chloe gasped, clutching the seatbelt. Marianne's voice burst through the radio from the rooftop, "He's gonna crash." Liam's hands moved instantly, precise and controlled. No panic. No wasted motion. He adjusted the collective, shifted the cyclic, countered the wind with micro-corrections that looked like instinct, not thought. The machine steadied. The tremor in the air faded into rhythm. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Chloe shouted over the roar. Liam's voice was calm, almost gentle. "I've done this, in worse skies." His words carried weight, not bravado. The kind of weight that comes from memory, of real storms, of nights where lives depended on his hands. They climbed higher, the city shrinking beneath them like a reflection in water. The morning light broke through the clouds, turning the buildings into blades of gold and glass. Liam banked left, guiding the helicopter over Elliott Bay. Below them, the water mirrored the sky, rippling with light. Chloe stared out the window, the skyline gliding past, and for the first time in years, she felt something she didn't have a word for. It wasn't fear. It was awe. She looked at him again. The way his eyes scanned the horizon, every movement measured, no hesitation, no second-guessing. The same man she'd mocked an hour ago now looked like he belonged to another world entirely. The headset crackled with her breathing. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, trying to sound composed but failing. "I used to fly," he said simply. "For a living." The answer landed like a drop of water in stillness, quiet but impossible to ignore. The helicopter drifted toward the downtown landing pad, its descent smooth as silk. Chloe realized she hadn't breathed properly in minutes. Her fingers unclenched from the armrest, trembling slightly. The city noise returned as they lowered through the final layer of air. Cars, sirens, people, life rushing by, oblivious to what had just happened above them. The helicopter touched down so gently the cup of coffee in the console didn't ripple. Liam powered down the engine, the hum fading to silence. For a few seconds, all Chloe could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. She turned to him. "Who are you?" Liam removed his headset, eyes still forward. "Someone who used to matter." Then he opened the door and stepped out into the wind. Chloe stayed seated, staring straight ahead. The skyline shimmered through the windshield, blurred by the morning haze. She had no words. The janitor she'd laughed at had just flown her across the city with the precision of a man who belonged to the sky. As the blade slowed to a stop, she caught her own reflection in the glass, someone powerful, yes, but suddenly small. On the rooftop where arrogance met truth, Chloe Kensington realized something she'd never admit out loud: she hadn't been in control at all. The office was quiet that night, the kind of silence that settles only after everyone has gone home and the city outside turns to mist. Chloe Kensington sat in her corner office, a tower of glass and light hovering over Seattle. Her desk was buried under contracts and spreadsheets, but her mind wasn't in the numbers anymore. She had been trying to focus for hours, yet every time she blinked, she saw the same image: Liam Walker's hand steady on the helicopter controls, the calm in his eyes as the world tilted. She had mocked him, then trusted him, and he had not only delivered but done it with mastery she couldn't explain. Who was he really? The question clung to her as the clock ticked past midnight. Eventually, she gave up pretending to work and stepped out into the hallway. The building was dim except for the soft glow of emergency lights reflecting off polished floors. Somewhere down the corridor, she heard the faint hum of a floor buffer, the low rhythm of work continuing after the executives had left. Following the sound, she reached the lobby. That's where she saw him. Liam was there, pushing a mop, sleeves rolled to his forearms. His son, the little boy she'd seen once before in the cafeteria, was asleep on the couch nearby, curled beneath a thin blanket. The child's small chest rose and fell with each breath, a stuffed bear tucked under his arm. Every few minutes, Liam paused to glance over, adjusting the blanket, brushing a stray curl from the boy's forehead. The gesture was so tender it stopped Chloe where she stood. She stayed hidden behind the glass wall, watching. A nurse from the company's small medical unit passed by, carrying a first aid kit. "Evening, Captain," she whispered in passing, offering a tired smile. Liam looked up and nodded politely, his voice low. "Evening, ma'am." Chloe frowned. "Captain." The nurse knelt beside the sleeping boy, checking his temperature with the back of her hand. "Finn doing better?" she asked softly. Liam nodded again. "Just a little cold. He'll be fine." "Still can't believe you're mopping floors here," the nurse murmured, shaking her head. "A man who used to fly medevac under fire." Her voice trailed off as she noticed Chloe watching. She smiled awkwardly and excused herself. Liam said nothing. He simply returned to his work, the mop gliding across the marble in slow, deliberate strokes. Chloe stood frozen, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. A captain? Medevac under fire? She turned away before he could see her and walked quickly back to her office. Her reflection in the glass elevator doors looked unfamiliar, composed on the outside, shaken underneath. Once inside, she sat at her desk and pulled up the company's employee database. The cursor blinked in the search bar. "Liam Walker," she typed. The screen loaded slowly, almost as if the system hesitated to show her what she'd asked for. Then the file appeared. Name, Liam Walker. Position, janitorial staff. Hired, 8 months ago. But below the basics, an optional field caught her eye: background verification, military record. Chloe clicked it. A document opened. Her breath left her. Captain Liam Walker, United States Army Aviation Corps. 2 tours of duty. Honorable discharge. Medal of Valor recipient. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism under enemy fire, having piloted a UH-60 Blackhawk through active combat zones, successfully evacuating 6 wounded soldiers despite sustaining aircraft damage and personal risk." She leaned back slowly, eyes blurring as she read it again. The janitor. The man she'd laughed at, dismissed, challenged to fly for a cruel joke, had once been a national hero. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then fell still. The weight of shame pressed into her chest. She thought of that morning on the rooftop, his quiet composure, his refusal to defend himself. He hadn't needed to. The truth had been sitting quietly behind those eyes all along. She turned toward the window, the city below glowing like a field of stars. In her mind, she replayed every moment since she'd met him, the laughter, the smirk, the mockery, and felt each one cut a little deeper. She tried to rationalize it. How was she supposed to know? But excuses didn't help. Not when she remembered how calm he'd been under humiliation. He hadn't looked beaten, only distant, as if none of their cruelty could touch him. He moved like a man who used to command the air, and now he cleans the floor. The thought made her throat tighten. She imagined what it must feel like, to once fly above the world and now walk unnoticed beneath it. A hero in hiding, pushing a mop through the hallways of people too blind to see him. The same people who thought power came from titles and glass offices. She stared at the empty coffee cup on her desk, realizing how small her own world suddenly felt. Control, efficiency, profit, things she had worshipped as success now seemed hollow next to the quiet strength of the man downstairs. Chloe closed the file and sat back in the dark, her reflection staring back at her from the glass wall. She didn't know what she was feeling, guilt, respect, something in between, but for the first time, it wasn't about numbers or deals. It was about dignity. And maybe, just maybe, about redemption. The morning light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Chloe Kensington's office, washing everything in a soft, golden hue. The skyline shimmered beyond the glass, but her attention was on the man standing quietly in front of her desk. Liam Walker. The janitor who had once flown her across the city as if the sky itself obeyed him. The man she had laughed at, and then discovered was a war hero hiding in plain sight. He stood with his cap in his hands, still wearing the same gray uniform, still carrying that same quiet humility that seemed out of place in this tower of glass and power. "You wanted to see me, ma'am?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. Chloe nodded, gesturing toward the chair across from her. "Please, sit." He hesitated, then did. She took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology," she began. "What I said that day on the rooftop, it was cruel, uncalled for. I didn't know who you were." Liam gave a faint, polite nod. "You don't need to apologize, ma'am. I was just doing what needed to be done." That response made something twist inside her. The same words he had said after saving her company's most important deal. Quiet, selfless, detached. It wasn't pride that drove him. It was duty. She leaned forward. "There's another reason I called you here." She tapped a folder on her desk, the Kensington Aerospace logo stamped in gold on its cover. "Skytech was so impressed by that flight, they've asked for someone from our team to consult on their new training simulators. Someone with real experience." She pushed the folder toward him. "I told them I had the perfect candidate." Liam didn't reach for it. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not looking for a new position." "Liam," she said, her voice soft but firm, "this isn't just a position. It's a chance to use what you know, to fly again, in a way. Good pay. Flexible hours. You'd be training engineers, not soldiers. You could do it from home, spend time with your son." She paused. "You could have everything back." He looked at her for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. "Everything I needed," he said quietly, "is right here." Chloe blinked, unsure how to respond. "You're turning it down." "I am." Why? He looked down at his hands. Because I don't need a title. I don't need to be noticed. I just need Finn to be safe. The simplicity of it hit her harder than she expected. There was no bitterness, no hidden agenda. Just truth. A man who had once held lives in his hands now measured success by the steady heartbeat of his son. Chloe felt her throat tighten. You could give him more, she tried. A better life. A better future. He has a father who comes home every night, Liam said. That's better than anything money can buy. His words hung in the air, heavy and gentle at once. For a while, neither of them spoke. Outside, the city buzzed faintly through the glass, distant and irrelevant. Then the office door creaked open. A small voice broke the silence. Daddy? Finn stood there, rubbing his eyes, holding a crumpled piece of paper. He wore a tiny jacket, too big for his frame, and his hair stuck up like a halo. It's okay, buddy, Liam said, standing. What are you doing here? Miss Marianne said you were up here, Finn mumbled. He shuffled forward and handed Chloe the paper. I made this for you. She took it carefully. It was a drawing done in crayon, bright, crooked lines showing a helicopter, a man with brown skin at the controls, a woman with long dark hair beside him, and a small boy in the back seat holding a teddy bear. Above them, written in shaky letters, my dad and Miss Chloe flying. Chloe's vision blurred. That's you, Finn said proudly, pointing at the figure in the passenger seat. You're helping Daddy fly again. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Chloe swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in her eyes. She looked at Liam, but he was staring at his son, his expression unreadable. Then, softly, he smiled. Thank you, buddy, he said, kneeling to hug him. Finn giggled, wrapping his arms around his father's neck. Chloe turned toward the window, pretending to adjust her blouse, hiding the tear that slipped down her cheek. When she looked back, Liam was standing, holding Finn in his arms. I appreciate the offer, ma'am, he said. Truly. But some things are more important than flying. She met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no wall between them. No CEO and janitor. No titles. Just two people who had both lost something and were quietly learning how to heal. You know, she said, her voice trembling just slightly, you could have been anything. Maybe, he said, glancing at Finn. But being his dad. That's everything. As they left her office, the light shifted across the floor, catching the edges of the drawing still sitting on her desk. Chloe picked it up again, tracing the crayon lines with her finger. Two figures in the sky, side by side. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest, something that wasn't ambition or victory. It was warmth. Simple. Human. The kind that reminds you what really matters when the noise fades and the sky goes quiet. The sun rose over the Skytech airfield like a promise, casting long golden stripes across the hangars and freshly painted tarmac. Banners fluttered, cameras clicked, and a sea of spectators gathered behind metal barricades. The annual Skytech Airshow was the kind of event where billionaires and generals shared champagne under white tents while the rest of the crowd craned their necks for a glimpse of machines that defied gravity. But all eyes that morning would end up on one man who never wanted attention. Liam Walker stood beside the helicopter he'd agreed to fly, a sleek Bell model polished to mirror shine. He looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces blending into a blur, then down at his son holding his hand. Finn wore a tiny pair of aviator sunglasses, the kind his dad used to wear years ago. You nervous, Daddy? The boy asked. Liam smiled faintly. A little. Mommy would be proud, Finn said, and the words hit him harder than the wind ever could. Liam reached into his pocket, pulling out the small photo he always carried. Sarah, smiling in sunlight, her hair caught mid-breeze. The corners were worn from years of folding and unfolding. He stared at it for a moment, then tucked it back carefully. Behind him, Chloe approached, headset in hand. She was dressed differently today, no heels, no armor of authority, just a soft gray jacket and a quiet confidence. "You don't have to do this," she said gently. Liam looked at her, the same calm in his eyes that had unsettled her months ago. "Maybe I do." She hesitated, then said what had been waiting in her throat since the day she learned who he was. "The sky still remembers you." A slow breath escaped him. "Then let's remind it who I am." He climbed into the cockpit, the door closing with a solid click. The sound drew a hush from the crowd. Inside, his hands trembled as he adjusted the straps, muscle memory meeting the ghosts of old fears. He could almost hear the radio chatter from years past, smell the desert dust. He closed his eyes, whispering to no one. "Stay with me, Sarah." Then he turned the key. The engine came alive, rotors spinning, building from a hum to a heartbeat. The control stick felt like it always had, solid, steady, familiar. The tremor in his hands stopped. Outside, Chloe stood with the headset pressed to her ear. "Ready?" she asked through the static. "Ready," came his voice, clear and even. The helicopter lifted off slowly, hovering before rising into the open blue. The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras followed him as he climbed higher, the machine gleaming like a silver bird against the morning sky. Liam's movements were smooth, confident, almost poetic. He banked left in a perfect arc, dove low enough for the wind to whip through the spectator tents, then pulled up into a vertical climb that made the audience gasp. He held the hover at the apex, steady, balanced, motionless against gravity, then rolled into a slow loop, the rotor blades catching sunlight as if they were slicing through gold. In the control tent, engineers stared at the monitor feeds in disbelief. "That's impossible," one muttered. "No one flies like that without autopilot." Chloe's eyes never left the sky. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she whispered into the mic, voice breaking. "That's your sky, Captain Walker." Up above, Liam smiled faintly. For the first time in years, the cockpit didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like home. He dipped the nose, accelerating into a sweeping pass over the grandstands. The downdraft whipped through the crowd, scattering hats and papers. Finn jumped up and down, waving both arms. "That's my dad," he shouted, voice cracking with joy. The crowd laughed, then joined in the applause, a thunder of hands and cheers that rolled across the airfield. Reporters shouted his name, photographers scrambled to capture the moment. The janitor had become the headline. Liam slowed the descent, easing the helicopter down with precision so delicate that it touched the landing pad as softly as a sigh. The rotors wound down, the roar fading into silence. For a long second, no one moved. Then the applause returned, louder than before. Chloe lowered her headset, wiping her eyes. She didn't care who saw. Liam opened the cockpit door and stepped onto the tarmac, sunlight framing him from behind. Finn broke free from the crowd and ran straight into his arms. Liam lifted him up, holding him high, and for the first time since the day he buried his wife, he laughed, a sound light enough to carry. Around them, the same executives who once overlooked him now lined up to shake his hand. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. But Liam wasn't looking at them. His eyes found Chloe standing a few feet away. She mouthed the words without the headset this time. "Welcome back." He nodded once, the faintest trace of a smile. The justice wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, dignified, like him. The man who had once been mocked for holding a mop now stood beneath the open sky, a father, a pilot, and a symbol of what it means to rise again. The sun was setting over Seattle, turning the glass towers into rivers of gold. On the rooftop of Kensington Aerospace, the same one where everything had begun, the air was calm. The wind whispered softly through the open sky, carrying the hum of a single helicopter resting under the fading light. Liam Walker was there, sleeves rolled, polishing the side of the Bell 407 with a soft cloth. The machine gleamed, its reflection catching his quiet smile. It wasn't a job tonight, it was ritual. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. "You're working late," Chloe said, her voice gentle, almost uncertain. She stood at the edge of the light, her silhouette framed by the sun sinking behind her. The golden glow touched her face, softening the sharp lines that once made her untouchable. Liam glanced up, smiling faintly. "Old habits," he said. She walked closer, her heels clicking against the concrete. "You still do that," she murmured. "What's that?" "Clean the things that already shine." He chuckled quietly, setting the cloth aside. For a moment, neither spoke. The city below pulsed with life, but up here, time felt slower, quieter. Chloe looked at him, really looked at him, the man who had once been invisible to her, now the one who had taught her what grace looked like. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke. "I didn't mean it that day," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "When I said I'd marry you." Liam smiled, his eyes kind. "I know." She took another step forward, close enough for the light to catch in her eyes. "But what if I meant it now?" The words hung in the air, trembling between them. Liam's breath caught, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Then slowly, he reached into his pocket. "You once said, 'Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you,'" he said, dropping to one knee. The gesture was quiet, almost humble. From his hand, he held out a simple silver ring, engraved with two small wings that caught the last glint of daylight. "So," he said softly, looking up at her, "are you finally calling in that promise?" For a heartbeat, Chloe couldn't speak. The woman who had built an empire, who'd faced boardrooms and billionaires without blinking, felt her throat tighten. A tear slipped down her cheek, glimmering like glass. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I am." Liam stood, slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting all along. She smiled through her tears and leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. Behind them came the sound of small running feet. "Dad!" "Miss Chloe!" Finn burst from behind a stack of crates, holding a handful of flowers, wild, uneven, and beautiful. "Does this mean she's staying forever?" Chloe laughed through her tears, looking down at him. "Forever," she said. Finn threw his arms around both of them, his laughter echoing in the open air. Liam lifted his son into one arm, wrapping the other around her. The three of them stood there for a long moment, framed by a sky painted in fire and gold. Then Liam turned to the helicopter, its polished surface glowing in the sunset. "One more flight?" he asked. Chloe nodded, smiling. They climbed in, Liam at the controls, Chloe beside him, Finn in the back clutching his sketchbook. The rotors began to spin, slow at first, then faster, the wind lifting their hair as the machine rose from the pad. Below them, the city stretched endless and alive. Above them, the sky opened wide, the same sky that had once broken him, now setting him free. Chloe looked at him and whispered over the headset, "Where to?" Liam glanced at her, then at Finn grinning in the back seat. "Anywhere," he said. "As long as we're together." The helicopter lifted higher, cutting through the last rays of light, three silhouettes rising into the horizon, proof that sometimes, the things we break become the things that teach us how to fly again. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.